Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's imagine walking into a royal tomb and seeing not a king, but a queen, draped in masculine symbols, yet with features undeniably feminine, a name half scratched out, a monument real, but only half remembered, a ruler whose reign was once inscribed across temples and gates, but whose memory is now more dust than detail. Her name was Sobeknefer, Eo, and though few people today know her name, she was one of the earliest female pharaohs in Egyptian history. Not a consort, not a regent, not a queen-in-waiting, a pharaoh. You may have heard of Hatshepsut. She came later, but before her, during Egypt's Middle Kingdom, Sobeknefer ruled only briefly and then, curiously, vanished from most historical records. Her story isn't tragic in the theatrical sense. There was no assassination, no palace rebellion, no known enemies, just ... silence, which is, in many ways, more unnerving to understand the strangeness of her disappearance. We have to understand where she came from. The Middle Kingdom, circa 205-01710 BCE, was a time of order being reasserted after the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. It was a fragile restabilization. Dynasties were still forming, and the royal line was often unclear. Sobeknefer was the daughter of Amenhotep III, a powerful king who reigned for more than 40 years. His rule was known for expansive irrigation systems, extensive architectural projects, and the mysterious labyrinth of Horwan, administrative complex so vast that ancient Greek historians would later compare it to the wonders of the world. But Amenhotep III had a problem. He had no surviving male heir. The most likely successor, Amenhotep IV, ruled only briefly, perhaps for less than a decade, and then, just as quickly, the line stopped. Into this vacuum stepped Sobeknefer. She took the throne not merely as a caretaker, but as pharaoh, assuming full regalia and pharaonic titles, including the 5-part titulary that legitimized a king's divine right to rule. And yet, in statues, she wore the traditional Ninos headdress. In inscriptions, she referred to herself with both masculine and feminine pronouns. In her mortuary temples, her images alternated between androgynous and overtly female. It was not gender confusion, it was political calculation. Sobeknefer was staking a claim in a system built entirely for men. She wasn't pretending to be male. She was demonstrating that she could embody what the role required. But the strangeness only begins there. Sobeknefer ruled for just under 4 years. According to the Turin King Lista, fragile papyrus, now held in the Museo Egizio of Turin, Italy, it's one of our only sources for her reign. Other king lists, like the Abydos King List, quietly omit her altogether. Think about that. Later, scribes went through the effort of removing her from the narrative. Not violently, not even disrespectfully, just bureaucratically. They made her disappear with ink and omission. There were no known uprisings during her reign. No catastrophic famines or plagues. No massive tombs left unfinished or temples destroyed. Just a silence that settled after her death. No children, no successor from her line. No clear tomb ever found. Though there are hints she may have been buried near her father's pyramid complex at Hawara. Even her monuments, like the temple at Tel el-Daba and possibly another near Mesguna, are fragmentary and partially anonymous. We remember so little that her reign has sometimes been dismissed as a footnote. But footnotes are often where the truth hides. And Sobeknefer wasn't just a placeholder between kings. She may have been the very first woman to declare through action, if not through proclamation. The state will not fall. It's because there is no man left to lead it. But here's where the cover-up becomes even more deliberate. The scribes of the New Kingdom, some 300 years later, recompiled lists of pharaohs for posterity and religious continuity. In doing so, they removed Sabanfiru entirely, not because she was scandalous, but because she did not fit the model. Not male, not dynastically continued, not useful to their story of divine, masculine kingship. So she was quietly erased in it, in anger. But in indifference, no dramatic downfall, just forgottenness, like wind eroding a cartouche from a temple wall. Her story wore away, not through force, but through time and silence. What remains? Fragments. A few statues, some bearing her name. Some, likely hers, but without inscriptions. A handful of seals, and lines from administrative documents that referred to year 1, 2, 3 of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Sobenferu. She was real. She ruled. And then, like a whisper in a corridor of stone, she was gone. It raises a simple but troubling question. How many others were erased so efficiently, so gently, that we will never even know they existed? Let's return to the 19th century BCE, to the shifting sands of Lower Egypt. Imagine a papyrus reed brushing against your ankle as you move quietly through the canal-fed region near Fayum, where the Nile fans into gentle marshes and fertile basins. This land was once reshaped by Amenhotep III, the father of Sabanfarua, man who left the kingdom in infrastructure that rivaled anything before it. The Fayum Depression was his legacy. Buried beneath it may lie hers, and yet no tomb has ever been definitively identified as belonging to Sobekneferu. We do not know where she was buried. There is no confirmed sarcophagus, no royal mummy, no mortuary temple echoing her name in full, not because it never existed, but because time, erosion, and the quiet chisel of historical selection wore it away. Some scholars suggest her tomb was begun at Maskuna, just south of Dashur. 2 pyramids unfinished, modest compared to the great spires of Gizeh, were discovered here. One was likely intended for Amenhotep IV, the other, perhaps, for her. But the pyramid is plain, its burial chamber incomplete, its owner unnamed. If it belonged to Sabanferu, it was abandoned before completion. This fits the quiet vanishing of her legacy. Egyptian rulers often spent their reigns preparing their tombs. This was part of the sacred cycle, built in life to be remembered in death. The pyramid was not just a resting place, it was a signal. It's an anchor to the divine. For Sabanfiru, that anchor may never have been secured. Why? Perhaps because she ruled for less than 4 years. Perhaps because the political climate changed quickly. Or perhaps because, even in her own time, her rule was seen as temporary, necessary deviation, rather than a rightful continuation. And yet, we find subtle resistance in her reign. Let's return to one of the only surviving monuments that clearly bears her name, a structure in the ruins of the city of Heraclepolis Magna, where blocks bearing her cartouche were later found reused. In later constructions, it's telling that her blocks were reused. In Egypt, this often signaled either economic pragmatism or political intent. Rulers whose memories were to be erased often had their monuments defaced, dismantled, or absorbed into later projects. Unlike the more famous Hatshepsut, whose memory was violently erased by Thutmose III, Sobanfiru was not attacked. Her name wasn't scratched out with hatred. It was gently omitted, a different kind of damnatio memoria. She wasn't remembered with scandal or slander. She was remembered not at all. Let's pause and reflect on that erasure, because it wasn't accidental. Egyptian scribes were meticulous. The Abydos, king list, for example, was created during the reign of Seti the first in the 13th century BC, several centuries after Pharaoh. This stone inscription listed 76 kings, each carefully carved in hieroglyphs, and Pharaoh is absent. So is Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Smenkhare, and Tutankhamun, were all left out for political or religious reasons. The logic was this: by removing names, the past could be corrected to match the present. These omissions weren't random. They were ediscurations of history to reflect a certain worldview. In Pharaoh's case, it wasn't her deeds that were offensive. It was her existence within the role of pharaoh. Egypt's ideology tied kingship to divine masculinity. The Katha, kingly essence, was thought to pass from one male ruler to another, uninterrupted. Even female rulers who took the throne had to fit within this framework. Hatshepsut, for instance, fully embraced male iconography, even referring to herself as son of Ammon in inscriptions. Pharaoh tried a different approach. She did not hide her femininity. She allowed statues and inscriptions to depict her both ways, sometimes female, sometimes female. It was a careful negotiation between image and role. A bold move, but perhaps one that made her too complicated to preserve in a neat narrative, so she was cut out, not as a punishment, but as a simplification. We see this again in the Karnak king list, another record of pharaohs from the New Kingdom, discovered in the Temple of Ammon at Karnak. Pharaoh is again absent. We are forced to ask, how much of ancient Egyptian history was curated in this way? How many rulers those who ruled in times of transition, who didn't fit the mold, who were inconvenient, were quietly removed from the narrative? Pharaoh may be the most striking example of a cover-up not done in secret, but done in plain sight. Let's return to the crocodile for a moment. Her name, Sabinfer, means beauty of the crocodile god, Sobek. It was an unusual theophoric name, invoking a deity more commonly associated with strength, fertility, and the Nile's chaotic power than with royal lineage. Sobek was a liminal god, both feared and worshipped, protector of pharaohs and devourer of souls. By choosing this name, Pharaoh was aligning herself with power outside the expected lines. The name alone was a bold statement. It suggested not just divinity, but unconventional divinity. But that name wouldn't survive the king. Lists that there are, however, surviving cylinder seals bearing her name, fragments of architectural inscriptions, a few scattered statuary pieces that escaped later reuse. Each one is like a candle flickering in the wind, and in these flickers you begin to see the outline of her reign: short, likely stable, lacking major conflict, and yet deemed unworthy of preservation. What we don't see tells us as much as what we do. No depictions of court intrigue, no texts of grand military campaigns, no surviving hymns or pyramid texts crafted in her name, and in that, silence. The cover-up becomes complete. Pharaoh becomes a placeholder again, space between rulers rather than a ruler in her own right. But there's another piece to consider. We must not mistake absence for insignificance. Pharaoh may have done exactly what she set out to do: preserve the state, stabilize the dynasty, and hand off power to a new generation, even if not her own. There's no evidence of collapse or civil war at her death. No interruption in temple construction. No loss of international trade for a ruler in ancient Egypt, especially one ruling without a clear line of male succession. That is an extraordinary success. And yet, that success wasn't enough to preserve her memory. Pharaoh did not become a symbol, a saint, or a warning. She became nothing, just another forgotten figure between dynasties. But here's the thing, it's not unusual to be forgotten in history. What's unusual is how deliberately it was done. The evidence of her reign exists, just not where we expect to find it. So perhaps the real question isn't why Pharaoh was erased, but rather, what does it say about the system itself that it needed to forget her in order to move on. Let us now return to that silent corridor in history, when the last breath of the 12th dynasty hung heavy in the air and the long, low sun of Middle Kingdom Egypt faded into a period of doubt. Sobonpharaoh, the last confirmed ruler of that dynasty, vanishes like a whisper between dynasties. But what remains in the silence she left behind? As we begin this final section, picture this: a lone artisan brushing sand off a block of limestone, chisel in hand. He sees a faint cartouche. It's her name, but his order is clear. This stone is to be reused in a new construction. New reign, new god, new memory. God, he hesitates for a moment, then begins to chip it away. Not in anger, just routine. Sobonpharaoh's legacy wasn't destroyed in flames. It eroded quietly, like a name written in water. But the outline remains if you know where to look. A forgotten precedent. There is no direct evidence that Sobonpharaoh gave herself a divine birth story, as Hatshepsut would later do. But perhaps she laid a path Hatshepsut would later refine and expand. Think of Hatshepsut, the more famous female pharaoh who ruled nearly 3 centuries later. Age. She was more aggressive in shaping her image, more invested in rewriting her legitimacy, and more present in temple walls and stone. But dead. She looked back to Sobonpharaoh. We have no text confirming this, but Hatshepsut would have had access to temple archives and historical records from Memphis to Thebes, and in some traditions, even whispered ones. Knowledge persists in unexpected ways. Sobonpharaoh may have been an example not of triumph, but of warning. You may rule as a woman, the records seem to say, but do so quietly, and don't expect to last. When Hatshepsut ruled, she chose to dress like a man. She adopted the full regalia of male kingship, the Nance's headdress, the Shendit kilt, even the false beard. She erased gender in public image. She stepped entirely into the male king's role. Sobonpharaoh did not. She appears in both male and female attire, in statues and stelae that survive. She's sometimes represented with the king's skirt, but a woman's form. She refused to surrender the ambiguity, and that refusal may have cost her her immortality. Still, it's a strange and quiet strength in not overcompensating. In being both transition and turmoil. Sobeknefer's death, likely around 1802 BCE, marks the official end of the 12th dynasty. With no heir, no strong succession, Egypt entered what would later be called the second intermediate period of time of fractured rule, shifting power and increasing foreign influence. This is not to say her reign caused the instability. In fact, the absence of chaos during her short rule suggests the opposite. She may have been a buffer, a dam holding back the flood of confusion that followed. What followed were the shadowy kings of the 13th dynasty, many ruling for months, not years. Power became decentralized. Nubians pushed north. The Hyksos began to press in from the east. The great monuments of Egypt stopped rising. The arts stiffened. The records grew thinner. And through it all, Sobonpharaoh's name receded, not because she failed, but because her memory didn't serve the new narrative. New dynasties needed clean origin stories. They needed to look back on golden ages of masculine strength, not transitional reigns by ambiguous queens. Sobonpharaoh didn't fit that mold. But here's the quiet irony. Her governance may have prolonged stability longer than anyone expected. The dynasty might have crumbled sooner without her. The dam might have broken earlier, and still she vanished. The echoes in stone and clay. Let's visit the Berlin Museum. In its collection lies a small bust of a queen. The face is damaged. The nose is broken, but the almond-shaped eyes and the slight smile suggest someone once powerful. Many scholars believe this might be Sobeknefer. We can't be sure. There's no inscription, but the style transitional between the classic forms of the 12th dynasty and the awkward realism that came after suggests a ruler bridging two worlds, Another piece, a cylinder seal found at Tel El Daba. It reads, Sobin Firu, given life. It's plain, functional, but unmistakable. Such seals were used to mark official documents, trade goods, or religious decrees. That one survived it all tells us she was real and official, and remembered by at least a few scribes. And in the ruins of Hawara, where her father, Amenhat III, had built a labyrinthine mortuary temple, her influence lingers. Some believe she may have modified structures there extending her father's architectural legacy. She didn't build new pyramids or temples. She connected herself to existing grandeur. She rooted her legitimacy in continuity, not conquest. Again, not failure, just subtlety. And subtlety doesn't survive in grand histories carved by successors who need clarity, not nuance. The gendered erasure Egypt's ideology of kingship was always heavily gendered. Even powerful women like Nefertiti and Cleopatra VII were allowed public authority, but often only through male relatives. Even Hatshepsut had to step into male form to retain power. Sobin Pharaoh stood apart. She ruled as herself. This may be the root of her historical cover-up, not her politics, not her religion, not her success or failure, but her challenge to the visual, linguistic, ideological constraints of power. She existed in a liminal space to female to be king, to kingly to be queen. And history had no room for that ambiguity. It was simpler to write her out, a cover-up, without conspiracy like the violent erasures of other rulers. Sobin Pharaoh's disappearance wasn't executed through destruction. It was ... curated. She was edited out. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was bureaucracy. Later scribes, priests, and chroniclers wrote lists, made inscriptions, copied temple records, simply skipped over her, not with anger, with indifference. And indifference is often more effective than outrage. Outrage leaves marks. Indifference erases them. It's quiet triumph. But let's not end with tragedy. Let's imagine this. Sbanfiru, walking the Nile banks near Fayum in her final months. The fields are green. The irrigation system she maintains still channels water from the Nile. The peasants are planting barley. Children are chasing goats. The kingdom is quiet, stable. She knows there is no heir. She knows she is the last. But perhaps, just perhaps, she is satisfied. She held it together long enough. She played her part. No war, no rebellion, no temples burnt, no famine. That's more than many kings can claim. And perhaps that is enough for her, even if it wasn't enough for history. The final whisper, there is one more place where she may live on. In your mind, because now you know her. Name. Sobekneferu. The woman who ruled. The woman who balanced chaos. The woman who chose quiet legacy over spectacle. You might not find her in the king list, but you'll find her between the lines, in broken seals. In misattributed statues, in the gentle omission of scribes who didn't know what to do with her, and in every future question we ask about history's silence. So ask yourself this: how many more rulers are buried beneath the sands, not in body but in memory, waiting to be found again, found again? Close your eyes and imagine this: an endless golden sea of sand. The horizon flickers like a mirage. The air is dry and heavy with stillness. No birds fly overhead. No shade offers relief. The dunes roll on, each one identical, indistinguishable from the next, concealing whatever secrets lie buried beneath. This is the western desert of Egypt, and somewhere within it, perhaps hundreds of feet below the surface, may lie the remnants of an entire army. 50,000 men, Persian soldiers, dispatched by Cambyses II, the son of Cyrus the Great, sent not to conquer, but to punish. Their fate unknown, their bones never found. The lost army of Cambyses is one of the oldest and most enduring mysteries of ancient history. Part military disaster, part archaeological enigma, and part cultural ghost story. It's a tale that rests uneasily between history and myth, with sand for pages and silence for testimony. Let's unfold this story slowly, gently, and follow their path into the desert of no return. The historical trail begins to. Year is approximately 525 BCE. Cambyses II has just taken Egypt violently, successfully. The Persian Empire now stretches from the Aegean to the Nile, and yet Cambyses is restless. Egypt has been subdued, but not humbled. There are whispers of rebellion, of mockery, of resistance still alive in the temples and in the desert oases. One target in particular gnaws at him: the Oracle of Amen at Cy Oasis. This sacred site lies deep in the Libyan desert, far from the Nile Valley, surrounded by vast plains of scorching emptiness. The priests at Siwa had reportedly refused to acknowledge Cambyses' authority, perhaps even mocked his divine status as a foreign king of Egypt, and that Cambyses could not abide. According to Herodotus, Greek historian writing a century later, Cambyses ordered an army of 50,000 men to march westward from Thebes. Their task: reach Siwa, destroy the oracle, humiliate the god, Amen, silence the priesthood, and then nothing. They vanish completely, without a trace. The route to Sifra, Thebes, more likely from an administrative center, such as Karga, the army, would have headed west, passing through what we now call the Western Desert. This is not a single tract of sand, but a complex landscape of gravel plains, salt marshes, escarpments, and dunes. In the 5th century BCE, the desert was no less harsh than it is now. Water was scarce, terrain unforgiving, navigation nearly impossible without local guides. The Siwa Oasis lies about 500 kilometers west of the Nile, near the Libyan border. Even today, it's accessible only by long desert roads or flights. Back then, reaching it would have required careful staging water depots, camels, or pack animals, a knowledge of where the next well or spring might be. Did the Persians have this knowledge? Perhaps not. They were foreign to Egypt's internal deserts. Their empire had conquered Mesopotamia, but the Libyan desert was another matter. And what's more, Thebes went in summer. According to Herodotus, the army set out under a hot sun. They made it to an oasis likely the modern-day Dakla or Farafra. There they rested, then continued into the deeper desert. And then, Herodotus writes, a great and violent south wind arose, burying them in a sandstorm. No bones, no weapons, no camps. Just ... gone. Was Herodotus telling the truth? Kate. Many historians have taken Herodotus' account with a grain of salt. He wasn't an eyewitness. His sources were likely Egyptian or Greek, and they may have had reason to exaggerate or mythologize. The image of a vast army swallowed by a sandstorm was a potent symbol of punishment from the gods, a warning against hubris, or perhaps just a good story. But is it even possible? Could a sandstorm really destroy an army? Well, yes. The Libyan desert is capable of producing massive sandstorms called haboobs that travel at high speed and can disorient, choke, and bury those caught unprepared. In modern times, such storms have swallowed entire roads and towns. In the open desert, an army could lose formation, get separated, panic, without visibility, without orientation, without water. Death would come quickly, and once bodies are buried beneath the sand, time and wind would do the rest. But even so, shouldn't we have found something? A helmet, a sword, a broken cartwheel. Instead, we have silence, which makes the mystery even deeper. Clues in the sand over the years, archaeologists and explorers have searched for the lost army. Some believed they would find a mass grave, traces of Persian-era artifacts far from the Nile. In 1996, Two Italian researchers, Angelo and Alfredo Castigliani, claimed to have discovered bronze weapons, bones, and shards of Persian ceramics in the desert near the Gilf Khyber Plateau, hundreds of kilometers south of Siwa. Their theory: the army took a southern route, got lost, and perished. But many experts were skeptical. The items were not conclusively dated. The exact locations were never peer-reviewed. And some accused the Castiglionis of sensationalism. Other expeditions, including teams using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, have scanned vast stretches of the desert. They found old caravan routes, Roman outposts, and evidence of ancient watering holes, but no definitive Persian military camp. No cemetery of soldiers. The desert keeps its secrets. Alternate theories: not everyone believes the army perished in a sandstorm. Some historians offer other possibilities. 1. They never existed. Some argue that Herodotus' entire tale was mythic, a fabricated moral fable about hubris and divine punishment, rather than a real event. There are no contemporary Persian records of such an army, no mention in Babylonian tablets, no references in Egyptian temple texts. Could it have been a Greek storyteller's invention? 2. They were ambushed. Another theory suggests the army may have been attacked by local tribes, perhaps the Libyu or other nomadic groups. Strangers wandering the desert would have made easy targets, killed and stripped, their remains scattered, their bones consumed by wind in time. 3. They turned by core, were absorbed. Perhaps they got lost, turned around, and limped back to the Nile. Some may have settled in remote oases, blending into Egyptian or Berber populations. Over generations, memory of their origins would fade. They would become part of the landscape rather than buried beneath it. 4. They reached Siwa and failed. A provocative theory: the army reached Siwa, attempted to assault the oracle, and were defeated. Not by gods or sand, but by geography and guerrilla resistance. Siwa is surrounded by harsh terrain and had natural defenses. The priests may have hidden or fled, or perhaps they survived an attack and rebuilt. The Persians may have lost morale, turned back, and perished in retreat. But again, no records, no monuments, no bones, only sand. Why cover it up? Such a disaster happened. Why would Cambyses not record it? For the same reason rulers have always hidden failure. Cambyses was already unpopular. His reign was brief and marred by accusations of impiety, violence, and instability. He was said to have mocked Egyptian customs, killed sacred animals, even desecrated tombs, though these accounts, too, may be propaganda. An army of 50,000 men vanishing in the desert would have humiliated him. Better to let it be forgotten. In fact, Cambyses himself would soon suffer a mysterious fate, dying suddenly on his way home from Egypt. Some say accident, others say suicide. A few whisper assassination. The loss of the army may have been the first crack in his empire in history. Written by successors with little fondness for Cambyses. Let the crack widen into a silence. The desert as a graveyard of memory. Let us return to that silent sea of sand. It stretches far beyond vision, past the reach of our technology, past the limits of our memory. Somewhere out there, perhaps hundreds of miles from any known road, there may be bronze weapons buried just beneath the surface. A buckle, a sliver of leather, a fragment of human bone, or maybe nothing. Maybe the army was never real. Maybe it's a metaphor, a tale told to explain why a king lost favor, a legend shaped by the desert itself, where absence becomes the story. Because here, silence speaks, and in the end, whether they marched or not, whether they were buried or not, the lost army of Cambyses endures not in museums or textbooks, but in the heat shimmer mirage between truth and myth. The desert swallows everything, and sometimes it's the most enduring cover-up of all. So, consider this. If 50,000 men could vanish into thin air over 2,500 years ago, how many more secrets lie just beneath your feet, waiting for the next gust of wind to uncover them, The desert has no memory, they say. It swallows without preference. But if you listen closely to the sands of the western desert, you might hear whispers carried on the wind. Whispers of a time when oracles spoke with the voice of the gods, and the pride of an empire marched into oblivion. To understand why Cambyses II would send tens of thousands of troops into a barren wasteland, we must look not only at his military ambitions, but at the immense weight placed on divine approval in the ancient world. And that brings us to Siwa, not just an oasis, but a living shrine to the god Amun, not just a temple, but a pulse at the edge of the known world. The Siwa oracle, a god in the sand nestled deep in the Libyan desert. Closer to the borders of modern Libya than the Nile, the Siwa oasis was an unlikely spiritual powerhouse. Its remoteness gave it an air of sacred insulation. Its freshwater springs nourished groves of date palms and olive trees, a surreal burst of green amid sun-bleached rock and shifting dunes. But it was the temple of Amun that drew attention from pharaohs and emperors alike. Amun, god of air and hidden things, had become the supreme deity in New Kingdom Egypt. His worship stretched from Nubia to Thebes to the windswept sanctuary at Siwa. The priests there claimed to interpret his will directly through ritual, trances, and dreams. And they were not alone in their reverence. A century and a half after Cambyses' time, even Alexander the Great would make a treacherous detour across the desert to consult the Siwan oracle. What he was told remains unknown, but after the visit, he claimed divine parentage, declaring himself the son of Zeus-Amun. So imagine the weight of what Cambyses II was facing. King, desperate to affirm his rule over Egypt, he'd rejected by the one oracle whose blessing would make his legitimacy unquestionable. Some accounts suggest the oracle refused to acknowledge him as pharaoh. Others hint that the priests mocked his claim to divinity. In the eyes of an insecure ruler, raised in the harsh hierarchies of the Persian court, this was not just religious defiance. It was political sabotage. And so, in anger or, perhaps, in fear, he dispatched an army, not to fight an enemy, but to silence a voice, to erase a shrine, to command the gods to kneel. But gods do not kneel, and deserts do not forgive. Echoes of propaganda. Did Cambyses mock the Egyptian religion? The image of Cambyses II as a profaner of sacred things comes not from Persian records, but from Egyptian and Greek sources. Herodotus, for instance, describes him in harsh tones, claiming that Cambyses stabbed the Apis bull, a sacred animal in Memphis, in desecrated tombs. But was this true? Or was it the narrative of a conquered people framing their occupier as impious and cruel? Archaeological findings suggest the Apis bull buried during Cambyses' reign shows no signs of harm. Some Persian administrative records even reveal respect toward Egyptian customs. Priests were paid, temples were maintained. Tax structures were not immediately upended. Still, Cambyses was an outsider. Many Egyptians, no matter how respectful he may have appeared administratively, his foreignness remained unforgivable. His Zoroastrian background clashed with the deeply symbolic world of Egyptian gods, Keda, and sacred architecture. And in such a world, to ignore or challenge the gods was not just dangerous, it was existentially catastrophic. The mere rumor that Cambyses disrespected Egypt's divine institutions would have been enough to render his rule brittle, which may explain the deeper motives behind the Siwa expedition. Cambyses was not just punishing heresy. He was asserting cosmological control. But what if that control failed? What if the desert refused to be ruled? Sand, wind, and silence. Natural explanations for the disappearance. The western desert is not uniform. It includes wide gravel plains, chalk plateaus, and regions like the Great Sand Sea, an expanse of dunes so massive that it appears oceanic from above. The most direct route to Siwa would have required the army to cross more than 300 miles of this terrain, passing through key waypoints like Karga Oasis, Dakla, and possibly Ain, Dala, or Farafor. Each oasis represented life, water, shade, food, but also risk. Miss one, and you're done. The sun would have beat down relentlessly. Temperatures could rise above 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, the desert would offer bitter cold. Winds particularly, the Kempson could pick up suddenly, carrying fine sand at skin-cutting speeds. These sandstorms can last hours or days. Visibility drops to nothing. Breathing becomes difficult. The landscape reshapes itself. What was a path becomes a trap. Imagine an army unaccustomed to this terrain. No GPS, no topographical maps, no satellite weather updates, just scouts, some water scans, in the hope that the next dune was the right direction. A sudden storm could have scattered them. Horses bolting, tents shredded, provisions buried. Once the army lost cohesion, it wouldn't take long for dehydration and heat stroke to take their toll. But still, the numbers boggled the mind. 50,000. That would be one of the largest non-combat disasters in history. Even if the number was inflated, a common practice in ancient texts, the scale of the tragedy remains profound. In the desert, indifferent and vast, simply closed over the wound. Siwa's reaction, resistance, ritual, or survival. There is no record of what happened at Siwa during the time of Cambyses' reign. No known inscriptions. No temple stele referencing an attack. No records of disaster or divine retribution. But the silence speaks volumes. If the army reached them and was defeated, perhaps the priests chose not to speak of it to let the gods take credit rather than themselves. Perhaps the army never came. Perhaps local guides led the army astray intentionally, as some theories suggest. Nomadic desert. Dwellers may have played both sides, agreeing to guide Cambyses' troops, only to abandon them in the dunes. The sand would take care of the rest. In this version, Siwa survives not by divine protection, but by clever resistance. A quiet victory, written not in battles, but in misdirection. A triumph whispered, never shouted. Modern investigations, fact, fiction, and the unending search, despite the skepticism surrounding Herodotus' account. Modern scholars and adventurers haven't given up hope. Satellite imaging has allowed researchers to scan wide swaths of desert for anomalous patterns, inconsistent with natural dune formations. In some cases, possible man-made alignments have been spotted. But verification is slow. The desert is vast, and funding is limited. The discovery of even a small Persian artifact and arrowhead, seal, a button could reignite interest. But until something indisputable emerges, the story remains suspended in a strange space, somewhere between archaeology and legend. In 2020, a joint team of Egyptian and foreign archaeologists proposed a renewed exploration near the Bahariya oasis. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were suggested based on subtle anomalies in the sand. But COVID-19 halted progress, and since then, the trail has grown cold. Like so many stories in the desert, it may be buried forever. Lessons in the Dust. The tale of Cambyses' lost army is not just about military failure. It is about overreach, about the limits of empire, about how faith, geography, and human fragility intersect in strange and haunting ways. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute, can be humbled by the elements. That ambition can be swallowed by terrain. That an entire force marching under banners of gold and flame can simply vanish. End. The end. Silence is sometimes the most lasting monument, because Siwa still stands. Its waters still bubble up from ancient springs. Its palms still offer shade. Its oracle, though long quiet, still holds sway in the imagination of all who visit. And somewhere out there, perhaps beneath your feet, perhaps beneath centuries of wind-sifted dust, lie the answers. But the desert isn't giving them up yet. Not today, not easily, and maybe not ever, not ever. Long after Cambyses II was gone, after the Persians ceded Egypt to new empires, even long after the Roman eagle fluttered above the Nile, the story of the lost army remained, not as a record, but as a murmur. A quiet thread passed between camel drivers, oasis guides, and the priests of forgotten temples. A story no longer about war, but about vanishing, about men swallowed whole by a place that refuses to explain itself. And for centuries, that was all it was, a story. Then, in the 20th century, something changed. Not the sands. They shifted, as they always had. But the questions got louder. Archaeologists, adventurers, and scientists began to ask, could it be found? Was it possible that Herodotus' tale was true, or at least rooted in something real? Could the Western Desert still be hiding the bones of an empire beneath its serene gold-silver hush? The route that never forgives. To understand where the army might have gone, scholars turned to terrain. Cambyses, too, ruled from Memphis, the former capital of Egypt, strategically located near the Nile Delta. From Memphis to Siwa is not a simple trek. It cuts across the inhospitable core of the Western Desert, dry, empty, and lightly populated even in the modern era. The most likely route would have followed a series of oases westward, from Karga to Dakla, then, possibly, toward Pharaoh Phra, and on to Siwa. Each oasis was a lifeline, where wells and springs fed palm groves and supported small communities. But oases are like stars in the sky. Miss one by a degree, and you miss all that follows. And so, some historians have argued that the army was not lost all at once, but degraded step by step. One group may have succumbed to thirst after their supplies ran low in the stretch between Karga and Dakla. Another might have been caught in a sudden sandstorm of Sirocco that buried them in hours. Others may have turned back, perished in smaller groups, or been absorbed into desert tribes. The idea that 50,000 perished all at once in a single gulp of wind and sand may be poetic, but it likely oversimplifies a slower, crueler process. Attrition, an army unraveling over days or weeks, not with a scream, but with a fading heartbeat. The 1930s rumor, bones in the sand in 1933. A sensational claim emerged from a pair of brothers, LSCL and Almisi, Hungarian, desert explorers, whose lives would later inspire the character of the English Patient. They claimed to have found traces of an ancient Persian army near the dunes of the Great Sand Sea, roughly 100 miles southwest of Siwa. Their reports spoke of arrowheads, shards of bronze, camel bones, and a carpet of human remains. But they failed to document the precise location, and years of wind have since erased whatever tracks they may have found. Some accused them of fabrication. Others believed they had indeed stumbled across a remnant of something ancient, but not necessarily Persian. The desert is littered with a flotsam of millennia. Traders, pilgrims, and soldiers have crossed it for generations. Finding bone and bronze in the sand proves little less. It's accompanied by definitive dating and identification. The Almasi story faded into obscurity, but it never truly died. Instead, seeded the imaginations of modern researchers, and the search resumed. Satellite eyes and the search for the invisible. The 21st century brought with it tools Cambyses could never have dreamed of. Archaeologists now employ satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal scanning to survey vast desert regions without stepping foot in them. These technologies can reveal subsurface irregularities, straight lines where none should exist, subtle depressions that may signal long-buried camps, and faint disturbances that suggest human movement or temporary habitation. In 2009, an Italian team led by Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione announced a bold claim. They had found the lost army. Their search had led them to an area between Dakhla and Siwa, near the Gilth-Kibor Plateau, desolate zone, almost untouched by modern development. There, they found hundreds of skeletal remains, as well as Persian-style bronze weapons, arrowheads, fragments of what appeared to be horse harnesses and water vessels. They believed it was a buried army. The press responded with excitement, but the academic community was more cautious. For one, the finds had not yet been peer-reviewed. No formal excavation followed. The team's work was filmed as part of a documentary, but key details like stratigraphy, GPS coordinates, and carbon dating results were vague or withheld to this day. No follow-up study has confirmed the Castiglione brothers' claims. The sand, it seems, continues to guard its secrets. Memory versus monument. The desert remembers differently than we do. We look for buildings, maps, inscriptions, something to fix in time and space. The desert allows none of that. It records history in absences and oddly shaped dunes, in the way wind moves over rock, in the silence that follows after all signs of life are gone. Perhaps this is why the story of Cambyses' army endures. It is one of those rare historical puzzles that exists not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. Every generation believes it might be the one to solve it, to find the truth beneath the mirage. But every generation also must face the same conclusion. There are places in this world that are too big, too old, too patient for human certainty. We build museums and archives. The desert builds erasure, and erasure, once complete, is almost wholly the larger legacy. Why the story endures. It's worth asking why this story still matters. Cambyses was not the first king to make a foolish decision, nor was he the last. Armies have vanished before through blizzards, floods, and political missteps. Why then does this one capture our imagination? Because it's not just about loss, it's about hubris. A ruler tried to control nature, tried to send soldiers across the domain of gods and oracles, tried to conquer a voiceless voice that would not be subdued, and in doing so, he sent men not to war, but to silence. There is something universal in that. Even today, we build systems to make the world legible. We try to measure the ocean floor, map galaxies, predict weather with machine learning. We tell ourselves that nothing is unknowable. But then, a story like this returns, and we are reminded that mystery is not a failure of knowledge. It is a kind of truth, a way the world teaches humility. What lies beneath? Final thoughts, perhaps. The lost army of Cambyses lies beneath the sand, still dressed in bronze and linen, faces eroded, stories untold. Or perhaps they were never there to begin with, and the tale is a cautionary fiction crafted by those who understood the power of metaphor. But even if we never find a helmet or a hilt, the legend has value, because legends tell us how people once thought they'd show us what frightened them, what inspired them, what boundaries they believed must never be crossed. In that sense, the desert did not erase the army. It transformed it from flesh to myth, from marchers to memory, from soldiers to silence, and perhaps, in the end, that is what the desert was always meant to do. In the low, undulating hills of eastern England, where the earth is soft, brown, and heavy with mist, lies a quiet field that was once thought to hold nothing but rabbits and roots. The place is called Sutton Hoo, and for centuries it slumbered. In the background of English countryside lies a patch of open land marked only by faint mounds in the soil, rising and falling like forgotten breaths in the grass. No one really noticed them. No one asked why the mounds were there, or what lay beneath. Even the local stories of ghosts, of buried treasure, of warriors under the ground had grown faint. They were passed down not as belief, but as fragments, the kind that get chuckled away at kitchen tables and in old pubs when the wind howls too loud. But in the summer of 1938, something happened that would change the history of early England forever. It began with a woman. Her name was Edith Pretty. She was not an archaeologist. He had no scholarly titles, no university position, no public ambition. He was a widow in her 50s, living in a red brick manor house overlooking the field in question. Her husband had passed away years earlier. Her only son, Robert, still young, but she had an instinct quiet and persistent that something important lay under the mounds, something worth unearthing. And so, with the kind of modest curiosity that rarely makes the history books, she contacted a local excavator. His name was Basil Brown. He was not famous, not even officially trained, but he knew the soil, and he had the kind of patient mind that the past responds to. What they discovered together beneath the mound, now known as Mound 1, would go on to rewrite what we thought we knew about Anglo-Saxon England. And yet, the story is not just about gold and artifacts. It's about silence, about memory, about the strange way that the dead remain close when we forget to look for them. This is the story of a ship without sails, buried in the ground, and the king who, perhaps not a king who, went into the earth without a name, a shovel in the quiet dirt when Basil Brown began his dig in 1938. He didn't start with grand expectations. He had no team, no academic funding, and no public spotlight. He simply began with spade and trowel, methodically stripping away turf and soil, layer by cautious layer. The mounds were deceptive. Earlier excavations from the 1800s had been clumsy, even vandalistic, leaving scars in the earth and broken pottery in their wake. But Basil Brown moved slowly. He observed how the earth changed color, how certain patches compacted differently, how a hollow in the ground might speak of old timber. Then, one day, he found rivets, iron rivets, in neat rows, each one a nail in something long and curved. He followed the pattern carefully. There were more than 1,000 of them, and they traced the outline of something astonishing, something no one had expected to find in the soil of Suffolk. A ship, not a little boat, but a full-sized sea vessel, nearly 90 feet in length, buried beneath the hill. There was no wood left. The timber had rotted away over 1,300 years of damp and pressure, but the rivets still sat in place, and the impressions of planks remained in the surrounding sand, like a fossil of a whale that had once swum not through water, but through time. No one had seen anything like it in England before. This was not a Viking ship burial, the kind most people think of when imagining warriors and boats in the earth. This was older, possibly from the early 7th century, from a time when written records were scarce and power was still shifting between rival kingdoms. As Basil Brown continued to dig, the shape of the ship became more clear. Its prow had pointed east toward the River Deben, which shimmered in the distance like a memory of the sea. And then, as he approached the center of the ship, the real treasure revealed itself. Not coins, not just weapons, but something more intricate, more royal, more strange objects of power. Carved from silence, what Basil Brown uncovered in that ship were items that seemed not merely valuable, but meaningful, ceremonial, loaded with symbolism that whispered across centuries. There was a sword with a gold hilt and garnet inlays, its blade rusted, but its presence unmistakable. There were shield bosses, spears, bared and drinking horns fashioned from aurochs wild cattle, now long extinct. A silver dish from Byzantium, buckles made with Cloyson garnet work, a lyre, a gold belt buckle shaped with astonishing detail, like something from a jewelry workshop. not a warrior's tomb. And at the center of it all is the most haunting item, a full-face helmet decorated with intricate patterns, framed by metal eyebrows, shaped like boars, a nosepiece, a mustache, a mouth crafted in relief. It looked like a mask of a forgotten god, and it had been, possibly ritually, then carefully placed with the dead. No body was found, only a chemical shadow in the earth, a stain where bones once lay, long since dissolved in the acidic soil. Who had been buried here? A king? A warlord? A priest? There was no inscription, no name, only the weight of presence, a feeling in the air. Academics later proposed that it might be Ridwald, king of the East Angles. He had ruled in the early 7th century, when pagan and Christian beliefs coexisted uncomfortably in Britain. He was said to have converted to Christianity, at least partially, while keeping pagan altars alive in his temple. That dual identity, some believe, is reflected in the burial, a Christian absence of a corpse, the pagan grandeur of ship and grave goods. But no one knows for certain, and perhaps that is the most English part of all. Quiet acceptance of an unanswered question. The strange thing about Sutton was not simply that it existed, but that it had remained untouched for so long. In a land so densely tilled, grazed, and combed over by human hands, how had a royal ship and treasure of this scale remained, buried beneath the Suffolk earth for more than a millennium, forgotten by the very descendants of those who had once bowed to the man beneath the mound? And why, even after discovery, did the true identity of the buried figure remain elusive, just out of reach, like mist curling over a plow line? As the dig expanded in 1939, the British Museum took a closer interest. The looming threat of war meant resources were tight and urgency hung in the air, but the items coming out of the ground were too significant to ignore. A team of archaeologists from Cambridge and London arrived to assist. Basil Brown, though eventually edged to the side in favor of more prestigious names, was never bitter. He had done the careful work. He had unearthed the outline. He had brought the silence to the surface, and the silence, in turn, brought questions, because while the objects were undeniably rich, they were also strange. The Byzantine silverware, for instance, how had it arrived in a 7th century Anglo-Saxon grave? Was it loot, a diplomatic gift? Had it passed through the hands of many before coming to rest in Suffolk soil? K. The gold belt buckle, beautiful, intricate, K. Impossibly precise in its interlocking design. How had such craftsmanship been achieved in a period so often labeled the Dark Ages? The helmet, with its face carved into defiant symmetry, did not look like the clumsy work of a people recently emerged from tribal obscurity. ID looked imperial, proud, almost Roman, but Rome had long since withdrawn from Britain. This was not Roman. This was something else. This was Anglo-Saxon Britain in its early flowering inserting itself not as a fringe colony of fallen empires, but as a culture with its own complexity, its own taste, its own evolving sense of power. King Ridwald and the Kingdom of the East Angles, among all the names whispered in scholarly debate, one rose with the most frequency: Ridwald, a king of the East Angles. His reign, from around 599 to 624 AD, placed him precisely in the likely date range of the burial. He is mentioned briefly in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, one of the few surviving written records from that time. According to Bede, Ridwald had accepted baptism in Christianity while in Kent, but upon returning to his own lands, he did not destroy the old gods. Instead, he placed both Christian and pagan altars side by side in his royal temple, a compromise that displeased both sides. Kia, but one that offers a peculiar lens through which to interpret the burial. Was the Sutton who shipped a Christian burial or a pagan one? It had no body, no cross, no written prayers, but it had grandeur, organization, and a symbolic depth that felt almost liturgical. The empty space where the body should have been was perhaps not a flaw, but a feature, a spiritual metaphor. Could it be that Redwaldor, whoever this figure was, had requested a burial that held space for both fates, a vessel that would carry him into the afterlife, regardless of which gods awaited him? The Sutton whose site, in this light, becomes more than an archaeological curiosity. It becomes a spiritual document, a negotiation between belief systems, a whispered statement about how complicated it is to change one's gods without changing one's soul, treasure, burial, and the politics of memory. One of the more quietly disturbing aspects of the Sutton Hoo site is how deliberate it all seems. The burial was not a rushed affair. It was not a last-minute internment in times of panic. It was ritualized, ordered, and designed. The ship was dragged from the river by men whose muscles must have burned from the weight, and hauled up the hill to its resting place. That alone would have required enormous labor and coordination. The hull, now gone, was once of oak-thick planks fastened with skill, shaped for water and war. It was placed into a trench, and the goods were arranged with almost geometric precision around the central chamber arms to the west. Food to the north, regalia to the heart of the space, and then it was buried, not under loose earth, but beneath a carefully mounded barrow one that would have been visible for miles around in its time. A hill of remembrance. But here lies the question: why was it forgotten? Why, by the 9th or 10th century, had the memory of the buried ship faded from local knowledge? Were there once records that perished in the monasteries during Viking raids? Did oral traditions dissolve over generations, lost to plague, war, and the passing of those who remembered? Or was there an act of deliberate forgetting and erasure of a complicated king whose dual worship made him an uneasy symbol? History, after all, is not only what is recorded, but what is remembered, and just as often, what is chosen to be left out. War, discovery, and the quiet that followed as the dig reached its height in the summer of 1939. Europe was spiraling toward war. The newspapers began to fill with rumors of Nazi expansion, alliances, and mobilizations. Britain was preparing for something that felt like déjà vu from 1914. And so, once the treasure was safely removed and studied, the Sutton Hoo artifacts were quietly boxed and taken to London. There, beneath the streets of the city, in the disused tunnels of the London Underground, the treasures were stored away for safekeeping during the Blitz. In those dark tunnels, surrounded by sandbags and concrete, the remnants of a forgotten king sat in silent vigil while a new war raged overhead. And then they returned to silence. It would not be until after the war that the Sutton Hoo find would receive its full academic attention. The artifacts were finally displayed. The helmet, meticulously reconstructed over many years, became a symbol, not just of Anglo-Saxon power, but of a narrative Britain had almost lost. Because the truth is, for Sutton Hoo, most people, including scholars, had a rather dim view of early Anglo-Saxon England. It was often described as illiterate, rough, barbaric, a gray, unlit space between the brilliance of Rome and the later flowering of medieval culture. But the Sutton Hoo find changed that. It showed that, by the early 600s, there existed a corridor at least to figure with access to global trade goods, skilled craftsmanship, hierarchical symbolism, and complex religious thinking. It showed that England was not simply being acted upon by outside powers, but was itself a place of rich, indigenous culture. It gave dignity to a forgotten century. But, even so, the man remains nameless. The burial, for all its magnificence, remains an act of anonymity, and perhaps that is what draws us back to it. A grave without a face. A story without an ending. In later decades, other mounds at Sutton who were excavated. Some had been looted centuries earlier. Others contained more modest burials, cremations, fragmentary objects, hints of a broader cemetery, but none rivaled mound 1. And no inscription has yet been found to settle the question once and for all. Who was buried there? The British Museum, which now houses the artifacts, avoids making definitive claims. The name Ritwalt is mentioned with careful disclaimers, possibly, likely, suggested by context. But in the end, Sutton, who resists closure. It is a grave that remembers without remembering, a ship that never sailed, a king without a name, and perhaps, in that silence, we hear the truest voice of history, not the chorus of victors, but the soft, steady hum of lives once lived, choices once made, beliefs once held, and forgotten songs that still echo beneath the earth. Once the trench was filled in, once the artifacts were photographed, boxed, and lowered into the depths of the London Underground for safekeeping, the field at Sutton, who grew quiet again. War came, bombs fell elsewhere. The farm continued. The River Devon flowed on. Life resumed with its usual pattern, slow, domestic, and grounded in the rhythms of the land. But something had changed. The hill no longer slept unnoticed, even though it was just a rise of grass-covered soil, even though it held no modern significance, and no clear sign of what lay beneath. The mound had become a symbol, not just of ancient wealth, but of a mystery unresolved, of a past not fully buried, a question raised from the ground and left hanging in the air like fog over the estuary. What do we make of a king we cannot name? What do we do with a legacy so carefully constructed, only to be forgotten within a few generations? The Sutton, who burial is often compared to the great ship burials of Scandinavius, especially those of the Vendel and Viking periods. And there are clear echoes: the prestige goods, the warrior's helmet, the sword, the symmetry. Anglo-Saxon England was closely tied to its northern neighbors by trade, language, and blood. But Sutton, who predates the height of Viking activity, belongs to a time before the longships began their raids, a time when the Germanic tribes had only recently settled the lowland kingdoms of England. This makes the burial all the more remarkable, because it wasn't echoing the Viking tradition, it was setting the stage for it. The Sutton Hoo ship, therefore, may be one of the earliest and most deliberate statements of royal power ever made in England. A message to the living as much as a send-off for the dead. It spoke of wealth. But not only wealth, it spoke of craftsmanship, metals, worked so intricately that even modern artisans marvel at the techniques. It spoke of visions someone had to imagine this funeral before it happened. Someone had to plan it, approve it, choose its symbolism with care. And it spoke of silence, because whoever planned this burial did not leave behind a name. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the grave was never meant to elevate a single man, but to honor an idea, the endurance of set, a people, the passing of belief, the weaving together of gods old and new. And so the grave becomes not a tomb, but a tapestry, one stitched together with iron and gold, mud and memory. What the artifacts whisper inside the reconstructed chamber at the British Museum. The Sutton Hoo helmet sits behind glass rebuilt from crushed fragments like a puzzle solved by patience. Its facial mask stares forward with quiet menace. Dragon heads meet over the brow. The cheek guards echo the wings of mythic birds. Across the top, flowing lines of silver-formed serpents and warriors in combat. It is not the helmet of a crude barbarian. It is the regalia of a ruler. But what kind of rule did this man hold? Did he reign with blood or with words? Did his people love him more, merely fear him? Did he die in battle or in bed, attended by priests and pagan seers alike? The helmet cannot say. It is silent, but it suggests something layered and complicated. Design itself is both artistic and martial, equal parts protection and proclamation. This was armor made to be seen, to be remembered. Other artifacts whisper their own truths. The sword pattern, welded, with its flowing lines of layered steels, peaks to a warrior's life. Not just symbolic, but practical. It's a tool meant to kill, but also to signal authority. The garnet-inlaid shoulder clasps, intricate and beautiful, hint at continental trade. Those stones likely came from as far as India or Sri Lanka, traveling across deserts and oceans before arriving in the hands of an East Anglian artisan. To hold one is to touch the ancient trade networks that stitched together empires. Then there is the purse Ladan item of subtle magnificence. It holds small golden panels etched with creatures interlaced in eternal struggle. Birds attacking snakes, wolves consuming men, warriors standing between beasts. The images speak in the language of myth, allegory, and power. This is not decoration for its own sake. It is coded narrative meant to be warned, shown, and understood by those who share the stories behind the symbols. In this way, the Sutton, who treasures are more than objects. They are a library. One, we do not yet fully know how to read. The queen of the Digno telling of Sutton, who is complete without returning to eat is pretty. Her role in the story is quiet but profound. Born into privilege, educated abroad, and married to a military officer, she could have lived her widowhood in quiet comfort. But something in her, some deep intuition or ancestral whisper, compelled her to look at the mounds behind her home in wonder. She did not dig them herself. She did not try to profit from them. She watched. She waited. She invited others in. When? The full scale of the discovery became clear when the British Museum offered assessments, and scholars debated provenance and ownership. She gave it all away. Not just the gold and silver, not just the objects, the right, the ownership, the story. She donated the entire find to the British nation in the middle of a world war, with bombs falling over London and children being evacuated to the countryside. She made an offering to history, and then she stepped back later. As the war deepened and rationing tightened, Edith Pretty refused fame, declined interviews, and slipped back into the rhythm of rural life. She died in 1942, just 3 years after the burial was uncovered. She never saw the helmet reconstructed, never saw the museum displays, never knew how many minds would be changed, how many narratives would shift because of what she helped unearth. But her presence lingers. The woman who gave us back a king without asking for anything in return. A hill, a ship, and a question that still floats today. Sutton, who is a National Heritage Site. Visitors walk along the paths between mounds. They read plaques. They look out over the River Deben and try to imagine what it once meant to live in a kingdom called East Anglia when kings ruled from wood-built halls, and horses walked beside longships, and death was not the end, but a journey to be launched. With ceremony, the field remains oddly quiet, though. Even with the tourists, it's the kind of place where the wind doesn't just rustle grass. It whispers, and the mound one rises with a kind of patient dignity. Not grand, not tall, but unmistakable. You stand before it, and you feel something. Not fear, not even reverence. Something quieter. The sense that you are standing before a question. One that has waited patiently for centuries, not to be answered, but to be honored, because not all mysteries ask to be solved. Some simply asked to be remembered. You've heard of it, haven't you? The Great Library of Alexandria. Not just the library, but the library. The golden symbol of ancient knowledge, the heart of scholarship in the ancient world. And if the stories are to be believed, the single greatest repository of human thought ever assembled before modern times. Thousands of scrolls, maybe hundreds of thousands. Ideas gathered from across empires, translated from dozens of languages, copied, cataloged, shelved, and then -nothing. Gone. Lost to fire. At least, that's what they say. But here's the thing. The story of the Library of Alexandria isn't as simple as a blaze reducing shelves to ash. There was no one fire, no single moment, no dramatic fall. Instead, what we have is something slower, stranger, and far more human. A quiet vanishing. A disappearance wrapped in layers of myth, era, politics, and time. In fact, if you look closely, there's no solid evidence that the library burned all at once at all. And that's where the cover-up begins. Not with the loss of knowledge, but with the loss of how we lost it. Let's go back, not to the moment it burned, but to the moment it was born, somewhere around 295 BCE, in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. A Greek king ruled from a palace overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. His name was Ptolemy I Soter, one of the generals who had served under Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy took Egypt and made it his own, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into a hybrid kingdom of ambition and splendor. But Ptolemy wasn't just a warrior, he was a builder of legacy, and so he ordered the construction of a temple not to the gods but to knowledge, a massive complex attached to the Mausoleum, the shrine to the Muses. This library would not merely house scrolls, it would become a beacon of learning, a lighthouse of the mind. He sent agents across the known world, Persia, India, Greece, even as far as Carthage and the distant Celtic fringes, with a simple order: collect knowledge, buy scrolls, copy them, translate them, bring them back. If a ship docked at Alexandria's port, its cargo of books would be temporarily confiscated, copied by scribes, and returned. The originals would remain. The copies would be returned to the owners, though not always in as good a condition. Rumor has it, even Aristotle's private collection ended up in the stacks. Over time, the library became something almost mythical. Estimates range from 40,000 to over 400,000 scrolls. Texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, botany, drama, politics. Works by Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Sophocles, Sappho. Ideas that bridged cultures, recorded oral traditions, and preserved ancient ways of thinking that might otherwise have died with their speakers. And all of it was stored in a city perched between two continents. A city that glittered, Alexandria. The lighthouse burned at night with fire that guided ships across oceans. Its streets were clean. Its philosophers debated under colonnades. It was the center of Hellenistic civilization, and then somehow it all vanished. But when, and why, and who was responsible? Let's begin with one of the most persistent suspects, Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar chased his rival Pompey to Alexandria during Rome's brutal civil war. Once in Egypt, he found himself embroiled in another power struggle, that of the Ptolemaic siblings, Cleopatra and her brother, Ptolemy XIII. Caesar, true to form, chose a side, Cleopatra's. In the ensuing battle, the city burned. According to some ancient accounts, part of the port was set alight. The warehouses, the ships, perhaps the library scrolls stored near the docks, went up in flames. But here's where it gets tricky. Not a single contemporary Roman accountant of Caesar's own writings is explicitly mentioned as the library of Alexandria being destroyed. Only later historians make that leap. Was it destroyed? Maybe. Damaged? Possibly. But erased? No. Even centuries later, travelers wrote of visiting parts of the Mausoleum, of seeing scrolls, of reading documents. Something remained. Others point the finger at Emperor Theophilus and the Christian mob in 391 CE, when pagan temples were razed. Across Alexandria, the Serapeum and another building sometimes linked to the library was torn apart, stone by stone. But again, there's no conclusive evidence that the main library still existed by then. And there's yet another theory, that the real death of the library wasn't an event, it was a process, Scrolls rot, scribes die, political priorities shift. A king funds translations one year and warships the next. Shelves gather dust. Clerks lose interest. No one copies the old books, 1,000 tiny forgettings, until, eventually, the rooms sit empty, not burned, just silent. This, perhaps, is the saddest version of the story. Not fire, but apathy. Not destruction, but decay. Because if a scroll sits, unread for 100 years, isn't it already lost? And so, we are left with a paradox. The greatest repository of ancient knowledge did not explode. It faded, and yet we still talk about it. Still imagine it burning. Still speak its name as if it were holy. Why? 'Cause it represents something we fear. Not ignorance, but the vanishing of wisdom. The idea that we once knew something important and let it slip through our fingers. Some historians now suggest the library never housed quite as many texts as we imagined, that 400,000 scrolls was an exaggeration, that the whole idea of it being the greatest may be propaganda by later writers. Even so, what if it wasn't? What if there really was a scroll explaining the Antikythera mechanism? What if there was a lost text by Heraclitus, a poem by Sappho, a detailed botanical compendium from ancient India, carefully transcribed and annotated by an Egyptian scribe? Gone, all of it. Gone, not just the text, but the translation, the annotations, the margins, the thoughts between the lines. The way knowledge passes between generations, always slightly misremembered. So, who covered it up? Everyone and no one. It's not that someone tried to hide what happened. It's that history moved on. It didn't look back. The real cover-up of the Library of Alexandria is not who burned it, is that no one ever told us when it died, and by the time we noticed, it already had. Now we're left with stories, fragments, hints, a list of authors who supposedly lived or studied there, a few quotations attributed to lost works, and the quiet ache of wondering, what if? What if the Library of Alexandria hadn't vanished? Would the Renaissance have come earlier? Would medicine have advanced faster? Would languages we now consider dead still be spoken? Would we have known more about ourselves? But we'll never know, because the library, if it ever existed as we imagined, is gone. And its death wasn't a fire. It was forgetfulness, which, in the end, is the oldest kind of erasure, the kind that doesn't require flames, only time and silence and a locked room. No one opens anymore. The story of the great library didn't end with a blaze. It faded like an old dream. But here's what few people realize. The books weren't just lost. Some of them were taken, not all at once. Not in a great heist with masked robbers sneaking out in the night. No. This theft was slow, gentle, quiet, and no one called it a crime because it was done in the name of preservation. It began with copies, even before the library declined. There were scribes whose job was to duplicate the texts, painstakingly, word by word, ink on papyrus, the quiet scratch of a reed pen, the only sound in the chamber. Some of these copies left Alexandria. They went to scholars, to rulers, to other libraries, the Library of Pergamon, the Roman archives. It's a private collection of kings. In fact, in one of the earliest ironies of this story, the Ptolemies themselves may have created their own future laws by sending copies out into the world. They allowed slivers of the library's essence to survive far from the fire, far from the forgetting. But there's more. By the 3rd century BCE, the Library of Alexandria had competitors. Not just other libraries, but other centers of thought. Pergamon in Asia Minor built a rival institution. They even innovated a new writing material, parchment, made of animal skin, because Egypt banned papyrus exports to try and crush the competition. Still, The scrolls spread. A few ended up in Athens, some in Antioch, others in Rome, and that's where the quiet theft begins, because as empires rose and fell, as rulers changed, these scrolls began to lose their Alexandrian identity. They were no longer labeled as coming from the great library. They were simply texts, treatises, commentaries, 1,000 names, no origin, no trace. A Greek philosopher might cite a passage in 200 CE and never mention that it came from the Ptolemaic vaults. A Roman senator might quote a lost historian, unaware that the only surviving version of that work came from a scroll copied in Alexandria, and over time, as scribes made copies of copies, the original margins faded, annotations were dropped, illuminations vanished, until even the words themselves began to change. The meaning shifted, the soul of the text dimmed, and the theft became complete, not of the scrolls, but of their context. What is a library, really? Not just a building, it's not just shelves. It's a map of relationships, of where knowledge came from, who shaped it, how it passed from one hand to another. A scroll in isolation is just a fragment, but a scroll that sits beside its siblings, that's a world. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a place of texts, it was a network, a system, a memory palace, and when that palace crumbled, not with fire, but with time its corridors collapsed, its connections broke. The texts that survived were like leaves torn from a tree, still beautiful, but no longer living. Still, some survived. Here's a little-known example. A man named Galen, a physician in the 2nd century CE, Roman Empire, Greek by heritage. He was a scholar of medicine, anatomy, surgery. His writings influenced doctors for over 1,000 years. And where did Galen study? In Alexandria, he refers more than once to earlier works lost now that he found in Alexandrian collections, works by Hippocrates, by unnamed Egyptian doctors, by Persian sages. And here's the strange thing. Some of Galen's own texts disappeared in the West, but they were copied, translated into Arabic by Islamic scholars in the 9th and 10th centuries. Scholars in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo. Why? Because the Islamic world launched its own quiet rescue mission, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, became the new Alexandria, a place where Greek texts were translated into Arabic, where scholars preserved knowledge that would have otherwise vanished in Europe's dark centuries. And so, Galen survived, through translation, through transfer, through theft, if you want to call it that. But here's the beautiful part. In the 12th century, Europe rediscovered these texts in Spain, in Sicily. In the Crusader states, Western monks translated them back into Latin from Arabic, which had translated them from Greek, which had copied them from scrolls in Alexandria, a long lute, a circle, and, at the center of it all, the echo of a library no one had seen for 1,000 years. The loss, then, was never total. It was uneven, lopsided. A philosopher's treatise survived, not her poetry. A mathematical theorem was preserved, but not the diagrams. A medical handbook lasted 1,000 years, but its notes on childbirth vanished. The theft wasn't of all knowledge, just the messy parts, the margins, the ideas that didn't seem useful at the time, and that, perhaps, is the greatest cover-up of all, that the library's death wasn't caused by violence or fire, but by selectivity, by choosing what to keep, by deciding what mattered, by letting the rest fade. It's easy to picture flames in ruined columns, harder to picture a scholar shrugging at a scroll and saying, "This one's not worth copying." But that's how we lost so much, through quiet choices, small forgettings, human limits, and sometimes politics, because some texts were deliberately destroyed. Writings by thinkers who challenged the dominant worldview, books that hinted at heliocentrism, at evolution, at democratic structures, not based on empire-dangerous ideas. Better to let them rot. Better not to translate them at all. So they vanished. Not because no one wanted to read them, but because the wrong people did, and made sure no one else could. Which brings us back to the library. Imagine walking its halls, scrolls stacked high, the smell of papyrus and oil lamps, a scribe dipping his pen, a philosopher murmuring a line in Greek, a student tracing a diagram of the stars. All of it gone. And yet, not quite, because pieces remain in monasteries, in Islamic manuscripts, in the margins of books, copied by medieval monks. Tiny fragments of Alexandria, scattered across time. Some survive in unusual places, like the Vatican Library, or an old Andalusian text found in Morocco, or a neglected scroll hidden in a Russian Orthodox archive. Every now and then, a scholar stumbles across a sentence just when that changes how we understand the past. A forgotten philosopher, a new take on mathematics, a reference to a book long thought lost, and suddenly Alexandria flickers back to life for a moment before fading again. So, was it a cover-up? Not in the way you might expect. Not a plot, not a scheme, just the slow erosion of attention, the failure to preserve what didn't seem valuable, the assumption that someone else, somewhere else, was making a backup. And now, we're the ones left with the fragments, trying to rebuild the whole from shards, trying to hear the voices of the past through the faintest echoes. And every time we do, we ask the same question. What else did we lose? What brilliance burned before it had a chance to spread? What secrets faded before anyone wrote them down? And could we ever get them back? The silence after a great loss is often the loudest sound of all. For centuries after the Library of Alexandria slipped into myth, no empire, no king, no scholar ever truly rebuilt it. Not for lack of desire, but perhaps because no one could. It's easy to build walls, shelves, chambers filled with books. That's not the hard part. It's the difficult thing, the rare and fragile thing. It's the shared intention, the will to gather everything. It's from everywhere and treat it all with equal reverence. That's what made the original library so unique. Not just its size, but its philosophy. It didn't only preserve Egyptian scrolls. It housed Babylonian myths, Persian medical treatises, Indian astronomy, Greek tragedies, Hebrew theology, Phoenician navigation charts, even curious notes from faraway Gaul. It was a crossroads, a mirror held up to the ancient world. And when it felt, however it felt, some shards glinted in other libraries. Others became part of new works, but most were swept away by wind, by war, by the hands of time. Yet we must not imagine the loss as sterile, because the loss had texture, sound, regret. It lived in the quiet shock of scholars who returned to Alexandria after a fire and found empty shelves, in the stuttering letters written by later historians who'd read of works they could no longer find. And in the strange way, history began to stutter. After the silence, because something changed. For hundreds of years, from the fall of the library into the early medieval period, there were fewer new discoveries, fewer big leaps, fewer bold thinkers. It was as if the momentum of the ancient world had been interrupted, as if the machine of curiosity had lost its central gear. And so, civilizations turned inward. Empires became more focused on power than philosophy. Monasteries preserved what they had, but often hesitated to seek out more. The spirit of universal collection, the dream of knowing all that could be known, dimmed, not entirely, but enough that it took 1,000 years for humanity to recover it. Even today, we're still trying to rebuild that dream. But back then, those long centuries after Alexandria's fall, the silence lingered. There were rumors, coarse whispers, that some scrolls had survived, that private collectors in Constantinople held rare Alexandrian texts, that certain Arabic commentaries still bore traces of older Greek insights. Now, forgotten in Europe, a few of these rumors proved true, but many were just hope dressed in parchment. Still, hope is powerful. In the 12th century, a scholar named Gerard of Cremona traveled from Italy to Toledo, Spain. He had heard that Arabic translations of ancient texts were stored in libraries, their works lost to Europe since Roman times. He arrived to find not only Galen and Aristotle, but forgotten works on optics, chemistry, geometry. He translated over 70 texts, and when he finished, he wrote something unusual in his notebook. In the East, they kept what we burned. In the dust of old books, I found a future. What had Europe burned? Sometimes, literally, books deemed heretical or pagan, but more often it was a burning of attention, a slow neglect, a choice to copy some texts and not others. Over time, this quiet editing reshaped what the West believed was ancient knowledge. Entire civilizations were left out, entire sciences forgotten. For example, the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in 1901, shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It was a complex, gear-driven device, essentially an ancient analog computer, designed to track celestial movements for over a century. Scholars tried to understand it, and then someone asked, where were the instructions? The user manual. It must have existed, and likely was stored in Alexandria. A scroll that explained how to build it, calibrate it, maintain it. Gone. Imagine what modern science would look like if that text had survived. Would Newton have needed to discover the laws of motion? Would Galileo have still stood alone, muttering about the moons of Jupiter? Or would the work of forgotten Greek engineers, preserved in Alexandria, have made the Renaissance unnecessary? We'll never know, because the scroll is missing, but its absence still leaves fingerprints, just like the lost books of Aristarchus, who first argued for a heliocentric universe 1,800 years before Copernicus. We only know of him through scattered references, quotes, rebuttals. The original works, gone, but someone copied them once. Someone filed them on a shelf. Someone lit a lamp beside them, and then someone forgot, and so they vanished. Sometimes people ask how many books were lost in the destruction of the library. Okay? The numbers vary wildly. Some say 40,000, others say 400,000. Some even claim 1 million, but numbers are it's distraction. What was lost wasn't just quantity, was continuity. Conversation across centuries was interrupted. Imagine reading only the middle of a sentence, understanding only half the map, waking up from a dream. You can't quite remember, but knowing it mattered. That's what the library's loss feels like. But here's the part that matters most. It wasn't just a tragedy of the past. It's a warning, because knowledge still burns. Not always in flames. Sometimes in broken hard drives, obsolete formats, censored websites, defunded archives. Sometimes it vanishes in silence. A scientist dies with unpublished notes. Language fades because no one speaks it anymore. A file corrupts. A library floods. And just like that, Alexandria happens again. Quietly, repeatedly, right now. Somewhere, a work of brilliance is disappearing, and no one will know it. It's existed unless someone copies it, preserves it, tells the story. That's why this story still matters. Not because we can resurrect what was lost, but because we can choose what to keep now. We can build new Alexandrias not in marble and columns, but in the cloud, in classrooms, in collective memory. We can archive more wisely, translate more generously, teach more broadly, and perhaps, just perhaps, we can rebuild the dream. Not the library, but the idea behind it. That all knowledge is worth preserving. That no voice is too obscure. That the next great discovery may lie in the forgotten margins of the past. And that when we honor what was lost, we protect what we still have. So the next time you open a book, or scroll through an archive, or wonder why a page is missing. Remember, you're breathing the ashes of Alexandria, and somewhere in those ashes, a spark still waits, somewhere beneath the windswept sands of southern Iraq. In the old floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates lie the remains of cities older than the Bible, older than pyramids, older even than the stories most of us were told about the first civilizations. Sumer. You don't hear the name as often as you do Rome, Greece, or Egypt, but this land of reed tablets, ziggurats, lies, and water clocks was the quiet, beating heart of civilization over 5,000 years ago. Here, writing was born, not poetry or fiction, but ledgers, inventories, grain tallies, and temple donations. And through these seemingly boring records, a timeline began to form, a slow, careful list of kings and rulers and city-states, some of which rise from the fog of antiquity like faint hills in the early morning light. But not all of them were meant to be remembered. You see, for every king whose deeds were carved into stone, whose temples still cast shadows across the Mesopotamian sun, there were others whose names were carefully omitted, not lost by accident, erased on purpose. Slow and methodical forgetting. In modern times, we might call this historical revisionism, but in Sumer, it was an art, and it began with a list, a very specific one. The Sumerian king list, written sometime around 2100 BCE, the list begins in myth. It names kings who reigned for thousands of years, rulers from before the flood divine, or semi-divine beings who lived impossibly long lives. But as the list moves forward, something curious happens. The reigns become shorter, more believable. Names become familiar. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Kish appear. Yet, even as the list seems to settle into historical reality, gaps remain. Entire dynasties are skipped. Kings who surely ruled are missing. Others are mentioned, but with reigns reduced, abbreviated as if their time on the throne was less worthy of record. Why? Well, there's no single answer. But one thing is clear. The Sumerians, like all humans, had a political memory, and political memory is never neutral. If a king was overthrown in disgrace, scribes might omit him. If a usurper rewrote his family line to claim descent from an earlier, more divine ruler, the past was adjusted, and so history became a living thing, fragile, prone to bruising, subject to manipulation. We know this partly because of archaeological inconsistencies. A city might show clear signs of being ruled by a local figure or palace, inscriptions, records of trade, but that king's name does not appear in the king list. Sometimes the opposite occurs. A name on the list has no archaeological footprint at all. No seals, no tablets, no buildings. It's as though he existed only on parchment. This begs the question, which is the truth? The tablet or the earth? And why does it seem like so many rulers were intentionally edited out? Let's take an example. The city of Adab. It was once a powerful place in southern Mesopotamia, home to over 20,000 people, an enormous population for its time. It had temples, irrigation, foreign trade, and an organized administration. Yet only one king of Adab is named in the king list, Lugalan Mandu, a powerful ruler. We believe the text. He claimed to have ruled over the four corners of the world, but archaeological evidence suggests other rulers came before and after him in Adab, and yet they were never listed. Clay tablets excavated from the ruins show administrative activity spanning generations. There were canal projects under new names, grain taxes overseen by unfamiliar officials, and evidence of military campaigns beyond the reach of Lugalan Mandu. One seal impression, discovered near the base of a destroyed temple, names a ruler called Mian Lil, completely absent from any known king list. Who was he? Why was he forgotten? The answer, in truth, may lie not in what he did, but who recorded his memory. In ancient Sumer, scribes were often employed by temples or kings themselves. Memory was a tool of legitimacy. If a new ruler emerged after a civil conflict or an unpopular transition of power, the scribes would often adjust the record, pruning the royal tree to make the new branch appear smoother, straighter. It wasn't about deception. Exactly, it was about coherence, order, divine narrative, and Sumerian political thought. Kingship descended from the heavens. It was never taken. It was bestowed. Even if violence won a throne, scribes would rewrite the tale as divine will made manifest. And inconvenient kings, those who gained power through rebellion, through outside alliances, or who ruled in defiance of religious order, were often scrubbed out. Their names faded, not because of weather or war, but because someone chose not to inscribe them at all. This brings us to the most curious omission of all. Kushan Interregnum. Around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire, the first true empire in recorded history, collapsed. Or, about a century afterward, control over Sumer fractured. In its place rose the Kushans, a mysterious people from the Zagros Mountains to the northeast. They ruled for multiple generations, based in key cities, taxing agriculture, building temples, forcing law. And yet, the king list treats the Kushans like a footnote. 15 Kushan kings are listed, but their names are simple, short, almost mocking in tone. Some modern scholars suggest the names were invented by later Sumerian scribes to belittle these rulers. Yarla, Gab, Yarla, Kurum, Apokin. These short, clipped names contrast sharply with the grand titles of native kings, whose names stretch across syllables and boast divine affiliations. Even more suspicious is how the king list ends their reign. It claims a native Sumerian hero named Utuhigul rose from Uruk, overthrew the Gutians, and restored the divine order. And yet, Utuhigul's inscriptions seem overly triumphant, as if compensating for a past that was never truly erased. If the Kushans had ruled as cruelly and incompetently as the king list claims, how did they hold power for nearly 100 years? Why? Do we find evidence of trade, religious offerings, and stable agriculture during this so-called Dark Age? And why did later dynasties, like that of Ur-Nammu, who came shortly after Utuhigul, spend so much effort rebuilding temples, codifying laws, and standardizing weights and measures if the Gutians had truly left nothing but chaos? Perhaps the truth is simpler and more boring. The Gutians weren't monstrous invaders. They were just inconvenient. Their rule didn't fit the narrative of divine kingship descending from Sumerian gods. Their language was different, customs unfamiliar. They might have ruled well or poorly, but either way, they didn't belong in the story that later Sumerian kings wanted to tell, and so they were remembered badly, or not at all. What makes this omission even more chilling is how many parallels it has across history. Rulers who lose wars are demonized. Usurpers erase the names of their predecessors. Those without scribes, the illiterate, the poor, the provincial, disappear entirely. The same pattern happened later in Egypt, where the female pharaoh Hatshepsut's name was chiseled out of monuments. It happened in Rome, where emperors declared damnatio memoria, the official erasure of a person's name and deeds. And it happened in the libraries of early China, where scholars buried the books that contradicted the dominant dynasty's version of events. But the Sumerians were perhaps the first to do this, to systematically shape memory itself. Even their gods were not immune. Take, for instance, the goddess Ninlil, once a major deity of air and south wind. Her cult shrank over time. Her temples were replaced, her hymns rewritten to praise other gods. In some lists, she appears prominently, in others, barely at all. It's not that she disappeared, it's that her role was reassigned, quietly, by scribes and priests with new alliances and political patrons. Erasure in ancient Sumer was not done with fire. It was done with silence. A name left out of a list. A statue moved to a dusty storeroom. A tablet left unfired and forgotten in a side chamber. Never baked into permanence. And because we rely so heavily on what was written down, our modern understanding of Sumer is shaped not just by what remains, but by what was chosen to remain. It's like trying to reconstruct a shattered jar from only the pieces someone deemed worth saving. Nowhere is this clearer than in the tale of the first dynasty of yore. It was a powerful dynasty, one of the earliest to truly consolidate power in Sumer kings, like Messenopotah, expanded trade networks across the Persian Gulf, established diplomatic ties, and filled temples with lavish offerings. But even within this dynasty, there are kings whose names are glossed over, replaced by more impressive successors. There's evidence of rulers whose seals bear their names, who commissioned monuments, who appear in trade documents, but whose reigns are cut short or not mentioned in the king list at all. Why? Perhaps they died young, or were politically weak, or simply lost a battle they shouldn't have. And so their memory was shortened, adjusted, quietly rearranged. One clay tablet even shows a king being referred to by a different name, possibly a scribal error, or perhaps an intentional alias to confuse rival historians. We may never know, but the result is the same: a fragmented past, stitched together with guesswork and inference. It's tempting to think of ancient history as fixed, as a collection of objective facts buried beneath layers of soil, waiting to be unearthed. But in Sumer, as elsewhere, history was a living thing. It bled, it healed, it scarred, and it forgot selectively. So when you picture the kings of ancient Sumer, try to imagine not just those whose names have survived, etched into museum glass and textbook pages. Imagine the ones who were quietly erased, the forgotten rulers who walked palace corridors, who commanded armies, who blessed canal projects and taxed barley harvests, only to vanish from memory because they didn't fit the story someone else was telling. Their stories may be gone, but the silence they left behind is still there, waiting. It's not always the name that disappears. Sometimes it's the building, the palace at Tel Taban, a modest site east of the Tigris. Should have been anonymous, just another mound beneath the Syrian plains. But in the early 2000s, archaeologists unearthed something strange. Not a grand ruin, not a treasury, just a room. A long, rectangular room with an oddly quiet presence. The walls were plain. The roof had long since collapsed. No statues, no inscriptions, no ceremonial plaques to declare who lived or ruled here. But in a sealed clay jar buried near one corner of the room, they found a cache of tablets, dozens of them, bent, cracked, and covered in dust. They had been hurriedly packed away, perhaps in the midst of a fire, or before a siege. And they told a story no one expected. The tablets mentioned a ruler called Tukulti-Mer, a name that doesn't appear in any formal king list. A name that, until that point, had never been found anywhere in the official histories of Assyria, Akkad, or Sumer. But the name appeared again and again. Tukulti-Mer received grain tributes from 7 villages. Tukulti-Mer signed a treaty with the temple elders of Ishnana. Tukulti-Mer issued payments to mercenaries from Elam and Susa. This wasn't a minor official. This was a ruler, king in practice, if not in memory. And yet no palace inscription bore his title. No monument declared his deeds. Even his tomb, if it existed, had been lost or buried elsewhere. It was as if someone had swept his reign under the rug. And so, the room was named the Palace with No Name. It was not the only one. Across the Sumerian and Akkadian world, archaeologists have stumbled across similar structures. Modest palaces with administrative rooms and clay archives, but no names. No grand doorways carved in stone, talical. Inscriptions in cuneiform, boasting of conquests over the four corners. Just simple records, receipts, ration lists, grain storage tallies. These were palaces, not for remembered kings, but for the administrators of the in-between, the men who ruled during times of collapse, the cousins who took over after a king's mysterious death, the military officers who maintained order when a capital city fell. They ruled briefly, and then they vanished, not from existence, but from narrative. The clay says they were there. The monuments do not. You can imagine how this happened. A city burns in war. The rightful king is slain. The general steps in to prevent chaos, not as usurper, but caretaker, governs well, even kindly. But when the dynasty returns, a surviving prince, a nephew from the temple line, the general must be erased. His rule was illegitimate, even if it saved lives. His presence is a contradiction, and contradictions are smoothed away. One inscription from Lagash describes a dark time when no king ruled. But the gods did not turn away. Another speaks of a steward who bore the burden of rule, but left no mark. And in one case, the king list simply includes a blank line, a space where a name should be, but isn't. A pause in memory, but the people remembered. They always did. Local records, often buried deep in lower layers of excavation, revealed references to rulers forgotten in the grand inscriptions. One tablet speaks of a king's tax decree, later amended by the governor in the time of the water crisis. Another mentions the man who set fair grain prices in a season when barley grew thin. In one beautifully preserved piece from Amma, an elderly woman bequeaths her land as it was protected in the days of Enlilmuki, the quiet lord. That name, Enlilmuki, appears nowhere else. No stele, no list, no hymn. And yet, here was a woman, perhaps a grandmother, remembering him not for war or building projects, but for the protection of land. A memory passed not through scribes or temples, but through lived experience. Sometimes, the people remembered when the state did not. But over time, even these memories faded. The problem wasn't just erasure. It was erosion. Clay dissolves. Wood rots. Buildings collapse. And so many of these quiet rulers, the forgotten stewards, the crisis kings, the peaceful generals, were lost beneath the sands. Only when archaeologists find a sealed jar or a charred archive hidden beneath a staircase do they return briefly, humbly, to the light. The palace with no name is now covered again, not out of neglect, but preservation. A protective layer of sand and tarp shields it from rain, wind, and the slow grind of time. But if you were to stand there at the edge of the exposed floor and run your hand along the old clay bricks, you'd feel it. The echo of a name not spoken, a presence without a portrait, a man who ruled, but was not remembered. And you'd wonder how many more like him once stood, quiet and uncelebrated, keeping the lamps burning through the darkest hours of Sumer. What did they think as they walked the corridors of unnamed palaces? Did they know they'd be forgotten? Or did they hope, quietly perhaps, that someone would remember, that a clay tablet might survive, and a curious mind might someday ask, who were you? And why were you erased? You have probably heard of the Sumerian king list. It's one of the earliest chronological documents in human history, a long, orderly record of rulers stretching back into the mists of time. From the legendary kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood, to the known dynasties of Uruk and Kish. It lays out history like a lineage, clean, sequential, logical, but the king list was never meant to be history. It was meant to be legitimacy. This was not a neutral log of reigns and dates. It was a tool, a declaration that power had passed lawfully from one city to the next, and that each new ruler followed divine succession, no matter the chaos in between. And that's the heart of the lie, because between the lines of kings, between the neat entries carved in stone and clay, there were gaps, absences, periods where the narrative is silent. But the cities were not. Those silent years often span decades or more. Take the period after the fall of the third dynasty of Ur. The king list says nothing for a time. It skips ahead from Ur to Isen without explaining what happened in between. But tablets from the city of Nippur tell another story. They speak of a man named Il-Lampil who ruled part of the region for 17 years. His officials issued grain rations. His scribes recorded births. His soldiers quelled unrest. He was not a warlord, not a usurper. K governed, but his name does not appear in the king list. Why? Because he didn't fit the line. K wasn't part of the Isen dynasty. His rule wasn't sanctioned by the priesthood that would later shape the record. He was real, but not official. And that, again, is the quiet tragedy of ancient history. It is often curated, it's not recorded. Just like how a museum display might omit a peasant's tool in favor of a king's goblet. The Sumerian scribes omitted the messy truth in favor of a clean myth. They weren't hiding facts. They were establishing order to the Sumerians. Divine kingship was not just about rule, it was about cosmic balance. The idea that one king succeed another in divine rhythm reinforced the belief that the gods had not abandoned mankind. History had a direction, that the world was not chaos. So when chaos did happen, invasions, rebellions, droughts, the scribes smoothed it over. Gaps in power. They were not recorded. Rulers who came to power through force or ruled only part of a fractured land, omitted. Even collective governments, like the Sukkot, assembly of elders that ruled Uruk briefly during one powered vacuum, were ignored. The king list preferred monarchy. It preferred the illusion of continuity. And this is where the cover-up becomes more than just a curiosity, because it means we've inherited a warped version of the past, not only because records were lost, but because they were designed to be incomplete. Some of the most important decisions in Mesopotamian history, grain reforms, water rights, military conscription policies, were issued under rulers whose names don't appear in the record. They're there in the receipts. They're there in contracts and treaties, but not in the story. Let's consider another case. There's a tablet from Shurpek, a city that was, for a brief time, the administrative heart of a region. The tablet is a set of instructions issued by someone, referred to only as the steward of the great house. It's mundane. Grain allocations, labor rules, deductions for workers who arrive late, but tucked into one. This paragraph is a reference to a new measurement standard, shift in the weight used to measure silver for tax. This may seem dull, but that change, altering the weight standard, would have affected trade across half of southern Sumer. It suggests a level of influence, even sovereignty, and yet we don't know the name of the person who issued it, because they weren't on the list. They weren't the king. They were just governing. You can imagine, then, how many names were lost this way. Governors who acted as rulers during succession crises, temple leaders who ran cities when royal lines collapsed, generals who kept irrigation systems functioning after floods destroyed, canals. Real people making real decisions. It's changing history and forgotten not through accident, but by design. Some historians today refer to this as negative memory. It's the phenomenon where societies remember by choosing what to forget. They erase people not by claiming they didn't exist, but by refusing to acknowledge them in public space. It's subtle, quiet. A clay tablet here, a broken seal there, a blank line in a king list, but over time, the silence becomes louder than any monument. We start to believe that history moved in a straight line from Gilgamesh to Ur-Nammu to Hammurabi, that each ruler inherited the mantle cleanly, that the gods smiled, always, on orderly succession. But the reality was far messier. Cities rebelled, kings were overthrown, trade routes collapsed, temples formed alliances. Sometimes a farmer's revolt toppled a local king. Sometimes a priest ruled for 10 years while waiting for the heir to come of age. These stories didn't fit the myth, so they were quietly put away. And the king list, that beautiful document, is often held up as a cornerstone of chronology, became less of a map and more of a mask of order, a mask of perfection, a mask that hid the many flawed, fragile, and ultimately human people who shaped the history we've forgotten. And yet, they still whisper in the lines of a legal document, naming a boundary settled by a man not on the list, in the copy of a hymn written in a dialect, tied to a region ruled by a nameless steward, in the clay receipt signed by a scribe in service to the household of the North, whose leader is never named. They whisper in administrative silence, because these forgotten rulers didn't build cigarettes. They didn't conquer empires. They didn't commission poetry. They governed. They stabilized. They endured. And maybe that's why they were so easy to erase. They weren't dramatic. They were necessary. And maybe that's what makes their absence so haunting. We look at the king list and think we see continuity. But what we're really seeing is aspiration. What we're missing is the truth, that history was always held together by people who didn't make it into the stories. The stewards, the governors, the palace scribes who kept the lamps burning when no king sat the throne. The quiet rulers of the in-between reflection. So, when we look at the grand monuments of Sumer, the pyramidal ziggurats, the lion-hunting kings in sculpted relief, the hymns, the Nana and Enlil, we should remember that there were other hands, other hearts shaping that world. Hands that counted grain, hands that signed treaties in reed styluses, not blood, hands that did not raise empires, but kept them from falling. Their names may be lost, their palaces may have no plaques, but their impact is everywhere. In the structure of law, in the canal routes that fed cities, in the stories that survived not because they were sung, but because they were lived. The king list was a beautiful lie, but the clay, the dusty, cracked, and overlooked clay tells the truth. If we're quiet enough to listen,